first of all, thank you very much to Tim and everybody here at the St. Patrick Centre for looking after us. We had a great night when we came down with the John Hume book. And I always believe you should go places in life where you're wanted. And well, I hope I'm still wanted here, but certainly you made a fuss of us the last night. So when we were putting the tour together, you were one of the first places on the list. So thank you once again for your hospitality and your kindness tonight.
I should just make it clear before we start that I'm Gareth Gordon and he's Stephen Walker, because believe it or not, we quite often get mixed up.
Even though there's a 20-year age difference.
Whenever Stephen launched his Hume book at the Mandela Hall at Queen's, I was unavoidably late. So I'm wandering up half an hour late, and I could hear somebody shouting, Stephen, Stephen, Stephen. And I look around, so he thinks I'm Stephen Walker, which confused me, because why would I be hanging about outside my own book launch? And then when Stephen launched this one, because he has launched it several times, it's
that a dig?
It's like the Titanic, but he launched it at Queen's. And Jim Nicholson, who some of you will know, the former Ulster Unionist MEP, he came up to me and says, I want you to sign this book, boy. And I'm thinking, he thinks I'm Stephen Walker. And I had to work out, will I sign it as myself or as Stephen Walker? But I think he worked it out.
And we look nothing alike.
No. The last time I was in this building, I greatly annoyed the Northern Ireland office, because the Secretary of State then, Chris Heaton Harris, was here to meet Chris Hazard, the local MP upstairs, but he got sort of hijacked by a lot of angry business people following the floods in Downpatrick. And they were so angry that his people said they decided to slip him out by the back door. And for some reason I reported that, and the NIO really got annoyed. So I'll tell you that story just to let you know there is a back door. If this goes on a bit, but it's locked. So anyway, without further ado, we've killed about 5 minutes there, Stephen.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm going to read some of the words people have used to describe David Trimble in this book, and these are only some of the words. Fascinating, mercurial, skittish, grumpy, giddy, irascible, blunt, impressive, difficult, highly intelligent, laser-like, intellectual, shy, awkward, rude, standoffish, visionary, reactionary, charming, combative, and my own personal favourite, because I think it applies to me, Thran. Now, all these words are not complimentary, you will have noticed, but I suspect if David Trimble was here tonight, he wouldn't argue with many of them, because Stephen, the man you wrote this book about, was a very complex human being.
He was, and he was all those things. And it's great tonight that a number of our, my former colleagues and your current colleagues, because you're still at the BBC, are here tonight. I mean, we must have at least half a dozen journalists in the audience tonight. We could probably have an NUJ meeting afterwards if you want to hang around for that. And I think all of us here will probably have had experiences with David Trimble. And, you know, he could be particularly brusque with journalists, and he could be all those things. You know, he could be charming and mercurial, he could be lovely, he could be kind, but he could be angry. And you'll recall he was often portrayed in the press. He was a gift for political cartoonists because they drew this character of this red-faced man, constantly angry, wearing the sash, getting very cross. So from that point of view, he was a gift. To cartoonists. Seamus Mallon famously said there were 7 David Trimbles, 1 for every day of the week. And he could be like that. I can remember the first occasion when I'd just been appointed as London correspondent, and I said to the wonderfully named Barry White, not the singer, Barry White was his advisor in London, and I said to Barry, look, I've just been appointed London correspondent. I'm going to have a decent relationship with David now that I'm over there all the time. And I knew David, and I'd had dealings with him before, so it wasn't a brand new thing. So Barry said, look, hang around outside the studio. David will do the interview, he'll come down towards you, and we can engineer a little meeting, and that'll really sort of oil the wheels, and that'll really help your relationship. So sure enough, I went up, I looked through the little porthole, and Trimble was doing his interview. I hung around the corridor, the interview ended, Trimble came out, and he walked in a certain way. He was always in a hurry. And so he came towards me at like 300 miles an hour. And I put my hand out and I said, Mr. Trimble, Stephen Walker, I'm BBC Northern Ireland's new London correspondent. I just wanted to say hello. And he said, hello, goodbye. And that was it. And so he did behave on occasions in a very odd way. And other people experienced that as well.
He had a few favourite journalists, and I wasn't one of them.
Right.
That's
understandable.
That is for absolutely sure. Well, we'll get to that later on. If you can go back to the beginning of David Trimble's life, and indeed of this book, he was always the outsider, really, in both his professional life and until kind of the end, his political life as well. Is that fair?
That's a spot-on observation. He felt he was an outsider. He went to school in Bangor. He was brought up in Bangor, as Tim was talking earlier on. He went to Central Primary School in Bangor. Then he went to Ballyholme Primary School. And then he went to Bangor Grammar. And in those early days of schooling, he didn't have a lot of friends. He was a bit of a loner. He was an academic. He loved books. I spoke to his sister Rosemary and his brother Ian for this book, and they talked about if David was ever missing in the house and you couldn't find him, you'd eventually find him somewhere, but he had a book in his hand. He absolutely adored books, and that's something that lived with him throughout his life. He often had 6 or 7 books on the go, very different books. He might have a book about medieval history, he might have a book about the Industrial Revolution, he might have a book about Cromwell, he might have a book about the history of Southeast Asia, or whatever, all kinds of different books, constantly reading. But what's interesting is in those early days, Gareth, he wasn't a great student. And he struggled at primary school, and he struggled in the early days of his grammar school. And I'm just going to read you a little bit because his school reports were pretty awful in those early days, and very much like mine were. So I he gave me a lot of heart when Daphne Trimble handed me over a series of documents one day, and they contained his school reports. I mean, absolute sort of gold mine. His work was very untidy. He was very messy. He couldn't read his own handwriting at times, and he clashed often with a lot of teachers. So this is what Miss Martin, the headmistress of Ballyholme Primary, wrote. She said, "David is probably one of the most intelligent in the class, yet this report rates him just very average, halfway down. So long as progress is made by written examinations, he will remain in this category. Unless he makes a real effort to overcome his indifference and write legibly and intelligently. His work is dirty, carelessly slat out, and his compositions so full of ridiculous mistakes that often it's not even worth marking. Very often he can't decipher his own figures. Look at his accuracy marks, 5 out of 10. That's a future Nobel laureate she's writing about. And then, of course, now that he's 10, there's the whole issue of whether he'll go to grammar school. And obviously his parents were very keen for him to go to Bangor Grammar. And on the question of whether David might get into grammar school, Miss Martin issued this strong warning. There is not the slightest hope of David getting the scholarship next year unless he eradicates this gross carelessness. So he was very much a loner, but in those early days of schooling, he didn't really get on at all.
So basically he ended up in Queen's as a law lecturer, and that wasn't straightforward either.
No, because he wanted to go to university, but at A level, he was given the wrong careers advice by Bangor Grammar. He wanted to go there and study history. He was mad about history. But they told him that to go to Queen's, he needed a Latin A-level, which he didn't. It was complete nonsense. So he didn't actually apply to go to Queen's. And then his dad gave him advice, as dads do, and basically said, what you need is a nice solid job. You know, a nice job in the bank or a nice job in the civil service with a pension or something like that. and eventually persuaded David to apply for the civil service, and he applied for land registry. And that was quite a boring job. And then he was thrown this lifeline of going to Queen's as a sort of a day release to study for a law degree. And he loved that. And then eventually he went to Queen's full time. So his journey to Queen's was unconventional. He then became a star pupil at Queen's. He got a first. He was the first person in 3 years to get a first. So much so that the County Down Spectator put it on their front page. It was a classic sort of local boy does good story. And then Queen's University offered him a job and he became a law lecturer.
And at the same time, he was becoming increasingly interested in politics, but it wasn't a convention. Well, in those days, a thing called Vanguard, which was very much to the right in the Unionist spectrum, Ulster clubs. He was a street politician, and he certainly wasn't a member of the Ulster Unionist Party in his early days. In fact, the Ulster Unionist Party didn't seem to want him.
Well, there was a bit of a cock-up because he wrote to the Ulster Unionist Party or filled in the application form, and they lost it. Now, whether they lost it deliberately or whether it didn't arrive, it certainly didn't arrive. Now, how history could have been different if they had accepted him in the early 70s, but nonetheless, it didn't materialise. You're absolutely right. For those who are quite young in the audience, Vanguard was a right-wing organisation. Many in the nationalist and Republican community found Vanguard quite sinister. It was led by Bill Craig. People would turn up at meetings with paramilitary uniforms on. Bill Craig talked about liquidating the enemy. So it was very much had a militant strand to it. Trimble was attracted to this, and he eventually became deputy leader.
And he carried his political viewpoint into his work. There's a piece in the book, a very interesting piece from the former Irish President, Mary McAleese, about what he did on the day after Bloody Sunday.
Yes. Mary McAleese is interesting in terms of this book because she helps me talk about the transition of David Trimble. She says, makes it absolutely clear, in her view, David Trimble was sectarian in the early 1970s. She was a student of his. She said he kept himself very much to himself and wouldn't have gone out of his way to talk to people. So when he did talk to strangers or talk to people that he didn't know, it would be highly unusual because it wasn't in his personality. But she vividly recalls the day after Bloody Sunday, Trimble going around students on the campus at Queen's, basically saying, oh, what a great morning it is. What a lovely morning it is. Isn't it a great morning? And he was going up to Catholic students at Queen's in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday. And as far as Mary McAleese is concerned, he was doing that, I suppose, effectively almost taunting Catholic students in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday. And she's absolutely clear in her mind what he was doing.
So he was an unlikely future Unionist leader who would cross the Rubicon and do what no other Unionist leader apart from Brian Faulkner, and we'll maybe mention Brian Faulkner later, has done by signing the Good Friday Agreement. And yet there were signs, if you look back, that he did realise times were changing and unionism had to change with it.
Yes. He opposed Sunningdale. He was against Sunningdale because he particularly opposed the Council of Ireland, because he believed that the Council of Ireland was a stepping stone to United Ireland, and as a unionist he wouldn't countenance that. He wasn't a fan of Faulkner. He thought Faulkner was too weak of a unionist, so he assisted the Ulster workers' strike. He was not a big figure in the strike. He was a backroom boy. He wrote bulletins and he gave them advice. He was quite tickled, I think, by the attention. I mean, you know, as an aspiring politician, he had an ego. He quite liked the idea that leading loyalist paramilitaries would know his name. He'd go back into Queen's and say, oh, Glenn Barr spoke to me today, and various things like that. So he was quite tickled by that. And then he ran unsuccessfully for Vanguard in North Down, didn't get elected, but he subsequently got elected in South Belfast for Vanguard, and he became a member of the convention. Now, the convention was set up after Sunningdale as an attempt to try and find some kind of new political vehicle to try and bring stability to Northern Ireland. And he then started to get intrigued with this idea of a voluntary coalition with the SDLP. This idea started to gather some traction. He and Bill Craig were in favour of the idea. It didn't really get much momentum within the SDLP, although Trimble and Craig were under the belief that unionists like Paisley were going to support it and other unionists were going to support it. But what ultimately happened was Paisley said he wouldn't support it, other unionists didn't support it, and effectively the idea of a voluntary coalition was dead. And with it, ultimately, Vanguard effectively withered on the vine and as a political outfit, died in the late 70s. But that's what you're referring to. That was one of the early signs in 1975 that Trimble believed there had to be some kind of accommodation, and certainly unionists couldn't govern Northern Ireland on their own.
So eventually the Ulster Unionist Party accepted his application to join.
Yes.
And then I suppose if I can put it like this, he got his break when Harold McCusker, the MP for Upper Bann, died, and he became the MP.
Yes, he had up until that point, and Daphne refers to it as this, Trimble had what's referred to as the wilderness years. So really from the late 70s to almost 1990, he was at Queen's, he was an academic, he was in the Ulster Unionist Party. They accepted his application in the late 70s. They found his application this time and they accepted him. Harry West took him on board, even though there was opposition within the Ulster Unionist Party to him joining the party. Because remember, he had fought against some people in the Ulster Unionist Party. So there was a little bit of bad blood in some areas, particularly North Down. And he went for promotion on a number of occasions. Three big jobs he went for at Queen's, and he didn't get any of them. And he wasn't going anywhere within the Ulster Unionist Party. He was referred to in the Ulster Unionist Party at the time as the nearly man, the man who nearly made it. He kept being runner-up. He kept going for various posts and not winning at selection. In fact, he couldn't even get elected in Lisburn as a councillor. So his luck was not in. His luck was not in the party, and his luck was not in at Queen's. He was enjoying family life. At that stage, Daphne and he had 3 children. He was enjoying his music. He was enjoying his opera. But politically, he wasn't going anywhere. And career-wise at Queen's, he wasn't going anywhere. And then, as you say, a sliding doors moment. Harold McCusker dies, and there is a delegation to the Trimble House in Lisburn. 12 men turn up from the Upper Bann constituency and say David should put his name forward. And Trimble puts his name forward and he wins the nomination. It's a highly contested nomination because it's a safe unionist seat. So whoever gets this seat has basically got a job for some time. So he goes in there and he wows the Constituency Association. They find him articulate. He says it's important to go to Westminster and create a good case for unionism, and subsequently gets a nomination, and off he goes to Westminster.
And then another sliding doors moment. Fast forward a few years, 2 things happen. Jim Molyneux is deposed as the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, and a thing comes along called Drumcree, where I used to spend my annual holidays. And nothing,
as a reporter.
It goes without saying. And nothing will ever convince me that but for Drumcree, he would not have been the leader of the party.
Well, that is a big factor. I don't think it is the complete factor.
I disagree.
Okay. But it is a major factor. But what Trimble was able to do was he was able to tap into that, call it the Orange constituency, but he was also able to tap into a constituency within the party who perhaps weren't Orange, but felt that the party needed reformed and felt that Molyneux was an old leader for old times and the party needed a new leader for new times. So yes, those images of Trimble and Paisley at Drumcree went across the world. He was seen as the hero of Drumcree, and a lot of unionists who felt that Molyneux wasn't strong enough and wasn't standing up for union looked at Trimble and said, look, this man is articulate, this man can go to London and argue the case for unionism, he is the right person for the job. Remember, and you are quoted in the book, because at that time lots of journalists were making calls at the time to try and find out who would be the next leader. everybody thought John Taylor was going to be the next leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. So much so that I think even the bookmakers stopped taking bets on Taylor.
But Trimble didn't even announce his candidacy until about 2 days before.
He did it very, very late. And there's a story in the book about you making a call to David. You want to tell that story?
Well, I was a nobody, even more of a nobody than I am now, in the BBC newsroom, and it was just feeling, it was about Wednesday, I think the vote was on a Friday night in the Ulster Hall, and there was a feeling that Trimble might just put his hat in the ring, so I rang him, and I said, are you going to run or not? And he said, funny you should ask, there's a woman in this office at the moment begging me to stand. And I said, well, are you going to? And he wouldn't say. So I came out, and there was a lot of BBC bigwigs, the sort of people who love Donald Trump, and Donald Trump loves them, standing around.
You know this is being recorded, Gareth.
We can edit that. But the BBC's good at editing bits up. So basically, we know how to do that.
When are we going to leave the BBC?
So I said, for what it's worth, I think he's going to stand. And there was a very eminent BBC journalist who's no longer with us, who said, he'll not stand. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room. And about 36 hours later, Trimble was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. But it doesn't mean to say I'm soothsayer or anything, but I kind of saw that coming. But anyway,
there's a similar story because Vincent Kearney and Mark Simpson, who worked as a journalistic double act, Vincent Kearney turned to Mark Simpson in the Belfast Telegraph newsroom and said, look, we're talking to all these potential candidates. We need to give Trimble a call. And Simpson sort of raised his eyebrows and said, well, why would we ring Trimble? Because, that's just a waste of time. And he says, no, we'll make a call and we'll take him out for lunch. So they duly took Trimble out for lunch at the Europa Hotel. Mark and Vincent are there. David Trimble walks in. They shake hands. Vincent says, Mr. Trimble, thank you so much for coming. David Trimble says, no, thank you. Because you're one of the few journalists that are actually taking me seriously. Thank you for inviting me for lunch. So it was all very nice. So their food arrives and the soup arrives, and then Vincent, tackles the elephant in the room and says, so are you going to run? And Trimble says, well, if I do run, I will win. At which point, Mark Simpson spat out his soup all over David Trimble. There were a lot of journalists who simply didn't think that Trimble at that stage was a serious contender.
Okay, well, assuming I'm right and you're wrong, and it was Drumcree and the hard man that got him over the line, how in God's name did that person in 3 years' time lead unionism to sign the Good Friday Agreement?
Because he believed that unionism was on a journey, because he believed that every time unionism went into a series of talks and they said no, and they went away again and they came back, the deal was worse. And he believed that the forces in Dublin and London would conspire against unionism and create a deal that was much worse than was on the table at the moment. And he believed that the timing was right. And he believed, ultimately, that there were things in the Good Friday Agreement that he felt would make Northern Ireland a better place. He was a committed devolutionist. He wanted to see devolution. He wanted to see local ministers taking local decisions. He was completely different to Jim Molyneux, who was an integrationalist. And so that was at the centrepiece of the Good Friday Agreement, that there would be an executive. He got consent written into those negotiations, and so he knew that parties that signed up to the Good Friday Agreement would have to accept the consent principle. He believed that the cross-border bodies, which obviously were necessary, he believed that they didn't threaten the union. And we can talk about the other things which caused him difficulties, notably decommissioning and policing and the release of prisoners. Those were the areas that ultimately caused the Yes campaign fundamental difficulties.
So he got the agreement. It was passed overwhelmingly in a referendum, but at the expense of his own party, because that started a civil war in the Ulster Unionist Party, which you, me, and many others had a front row seat at, and I still sometimes scratch my head and say that some of those things happened. It was an incredible time.
Well, those Ulster Unionist council meetings went on and on and on, and I think there were 13 in the end. And Mark Durkin went to see David Trimble at his Lisburn home shortly before David Trimble died, and they chatted about all things. I suppose it's a similar conversation that we're having tonight. And Mark Durkin brought up this very issue that you're talking about, those long meetings that went on forever. And I think he turned to Trimble during those discussions and said, David, I think there were 13 of them. He said, that wasn't a list of meetings, that was a novena.
We used to camp out. The Ulster Unionist Party headquarters at that time was a thing called Cunningham House in East Belfast. And we used to basically camp out on the footpath. And it was so bad that some of the locals rebelled. And we were actually threatened physically. It was so bad that the Ulster Unionist Party had opened the gates and let us into the car park because we were annoying the locals so badly. And there were things happening. I mean, there's a book Alone in the Ulster Unionist Civil War. There was.
I thought you were going to talk about the fuss on the bus.
Well, I was there. I was there that day.
You were?
That was another incredible moment. But
well, talk about the fuss on the bus, because that's good. That's good.
I'll get to that in just 1 minute, if you don't mind.
It's very bossy, isn't it?
I remember lots of incidents. There was a guy called George Savage, who probably not many people would remember now. He was an MLA with Trimble in Upper Ban. And Trimble, before one Assembly election campaign, things weren't going well, and he decided to have a helicopter tour of Northern Ireland. And George Savage was a farmer, and he wouldn't let him land the helicopter on the farm. And I know the guy had to go and tell Trimble, and you could hear the explosion at the other side of East Belfast. Well, the fuss at the bus, for those who don't know, there was a press conference in Ulster Unionist headquarters in Cunningham House, and I got a call from the DUP saying that they were outside. Their bus, the battle bus with Paisley and Robinson and all those people was outside. So I went out to see them, and it was the Ulster Unionist press officer of the time.
Was Philip Robinson would have been there?
It was
David Kerr would have been
no. No, you spoke to him.
Martin McNeely
in Belgium. He worked in Brussels.
Oh, Alex Benjamin.
Alex Benjamin. Great guy.
That was good that we were all able to name Ulster Unionist Party press office. That really is quite a unique mastermind subject.
It's an age thing. So
we got all of them, I think.
So Alex Benjamin opened the window and I said, right. So I'm interviewing Paisley, and I'm looking over his shoulder and I see Trimble and all this is by Jim said all these
television gold.
Coming, and I said, Mr. Paisley, I think there's somebody here to see you. And I looked around and there was Trimble, because at that point Trimble desperately wanted a TV debate with Paisley, and the DUP wouldn't let it happen because Ian Paisley was in fast diminishing. So it became the biggest slanging match of any election campaign I've ever seen. And Robinson was going, where's Jeffrey? Where's Jeffrey? And Jeffrey Donaldson wasn't there, of course, because he wasn't in the Trimble camp, but it was quite something. And Trimble was getting into his car, and I said, Mr. Trimble, that wasn't the debate you wanted. And he bounced straight out of the car. That was the maddest time I ever remember in my job.
Trimble actually, later in a BBC interview, some years, regretted going outside.
Well, yeah.
And regretted what had happened.
Well, I didn't regret it.
No, but it was. I'm sure you didn't. It was television gold, and still remains television gold. But he said, on reflection, he should either have invited them in for a cup of tea, which clearly wouldn't have happened, or he should have just stayed put. But he says in his words, and he mentions it in the book, he certainly shouldn't have gone outside and got involved.
I remember an Ulster Unionist annual conference in Armagh at the height of the war, when Jeffrey Donaldson turned up in the afternoon, and he sat in a chair outside the room, at the door of the room, and wouldn't go in. I don't think Arlene was there at all. And Martin Smith, who was the chair of the party, had to close the event and sang God Save the Queen. And nobody in the room joined in with him because he was on the other side. It was just, it was unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, it was. You're absolutely right.
But
it was a civil war.
There are those who say that Trimble could have handled that better. If he had had more of a common touch, he could have put his arm around Jeffrey and leave out anything that's happened since. Just not go anywhere near there. And he could have, he made all the MLAs who were also MPs give up the Stormont job, apart from him and John Taylor. Mm-hmm. And Geoffrey really, apparently, and there's somebody in the room who probably know better than me about this, people tell me that was the moment that Geoffrey decided he was going.
Well, Alex Kane makes the point that if he had allowed Geoffrey Donaldson, things might have been different. The thing about David Trimble, it wasn't in his character to do that. David Trimble was never the kind of man that would have sidled up to you and put his arm around you and said, well, Gareth, how are you today? Is there anything I can do for you today? Or what would make this better? He never did that. That was never in his personality. He was always awkward, even when he was, canvassing. Alex Kane talked about observing him during the 1990 Upper Band by-election that we were talking about. And he said, even Trimble standing on the doorstep of a potential voter, he said he was awkward. He said, politicians are meant to be able to make small talk, or if you're at somebody's house and a dog comes out and you talk about the dog, or a child comes out with a bicycle and you talk to the child, you have to have the gift of the gab, be able to say something to oil the wheels. He said Trimble had none of that. And he used to infuriate party officials because they would organise party receptions and there would be people in the room that had maybe donated money to the party, maybe substantial amounts of money to the party, and somebody would say, look, David, go over and talk to Mr. and Mrs. X because they gave us £10,000, and he just found that really difficult. So I think it was difficult from him from a characteristic point of view. There is a suggestion that David Trimble was autistic.
Well.
And that is raised in the book. David Trimble had a conversation with the journalist Ruth Dudley Edwards, and he turned to her at one stage and said, they're saying to me that they think I am autistic. David Kerr, one of his advisors, came to a similar conclusion, and Graham Gudgeon, another advisor, came to a similar conclusion. So I don't think it was in David Trimble's personality to put an arm around people and say, oh, come on, let's just solve this.
Autism wasn't as much of a thing we discussed in those days, but even then people used to say, well, I'm not sure I knew what they meant, he's on the spectrum.
Yes.
But I think you must take that into account, and also the pressure the man was under.
He was under enormous pressure. One person we haven't talked about tonight who is absolutely crucial to the David Trimble story is Daphne. And Daphne is an essential part of David Trimble's story. We talked about those meetings. Daphne even had a principle named after her called the Daphne Principle, which was, very simplistic terms, basically an ability to carry on. So Daphne said, look, all we've got to do is win this vote in 2 days' time, and then we move on to the next vote, and then we move on to the next stage. And I think it was Paul Bew that coined that phrase. So that became known as the Daphne Principle, or the Daphne approach to how he was managing it. So she was crucial. She was his first and last. In other words, when he had a big decision to make, he spoke to her first before he made that decision. She was probably the last person to speak to him. So she was absolutely crucial.
But it got to the point with David Trimble, I don't know about you, but whereas I did not look forward to actually ringing him up or interviewing him. And there was one day I'll never forget. Storm was up and down and up and down. So at one point when it was down, there used to be a series of choreographed events where Republicans would do something or Unionists would do something, then there would be something reciprocal, and we would see whether Stormont could return on those grounds. And I can't remember which one this was, but the plan was that Trimble would make a speech in the morning and the IRA would issue a statement in the afternoon, and everything would be fine. So Trimble made his statement, and then we beat it for the IRA statement. And the IRA statement came, and on every ground it fell short. Mm-hmm. There is no way he could come back. So the whole thing collapsed. Mm-hmm. And the next morning, I was tasked with getting David Trimble on camera. So I rang him, and he said, I'm at the city airport. I said, well, will you do an interview? And he says, well, I'm airside now. I've gone through security. And I said, well, is there any way you could come out? He said, well, the plane's been delayed. I suppose I could. So out he comes, and I was with a young cameraman, a freelance cameraman who hadn't a lot of experience. And I said, set up outside the airport. Let's not hang about here in case he changes his mind. And on the way out, he gets a phone call, which he goes to take. Now, he's standing probably 50 yards away from us. And I say to the cameraman, get some shots of Trimble on his phone, because you know the way when you interview a politician, you always see the politician conveniently walking into shot and out of shot, which is very formulaic and boring. So if you get him doing something really exciting, like being on his phone, that's a bonus. So he's on
Really exciting.
So he's on the phone, and he spies the cameraman taking the shot. Now, there's no way you can hear what he's saying because you are a distance away. I didn't know, but David Trimble had a thing about being filmed when he was on the phone. So I don't know what the guy on the other end of the phone was thinking, but Trimble came running up to the cameraman and said, "Do not film me when I'm on the phone." And I'm going, right, okay. Yeah. All right, sorry about that. So let's do the interview and get out of the way. So I asked him a couple of questions, and then I asked him another. And he turns his body and he says, "Now, I've given you a line I've given to no one else." And I can't for the life of me remember what the line is. So it turns out to be that in future, when he's dealing with the IRA, he'll cut out the middlemen who are Adams and McGuinness and go straight to P. O'Neill. Now, anybody remember, the IRA used to sign their statements, P. O'Neill. So I'm going to the main man, whoever he thought the main man was. I said, right. But I didn't think that was that exciting, so I had another question to ask. So I begins to ask another question. And instead of taking it out on me, the cameraman at this point is white. He goes, "I said the interview was over!" At which point, I put my hand on David Trimble's shoulder, which is another thing.
It's going well, Gareth.
He didn't,
going very
he
well.
Didn't like, and his security man gets between him and me and elbows me in the ribs. At which point, I've had enough. So he walks back into the terminal building, and there's some guy in a country Guernsey standing there, and he goes, "No surrender, David." And I never worked out, was he a friend or foe? And that was probably the last time I had much to do with David Trimble work-wise until...
Well, you see, he did have a very short fuse.
You're kidding.
Yes, I'm not kidding. And there is a chapter in the book called Hearts and Minds, because probably one of his most famous televisual encounters was his interview with Noel Thompson, where he is banging the table, or almost banging the table and losing his temper. And I interviewed both Noel Thompson and Mary Kelly, who many of you in the audience will know, who was a producer at Hearts and Minds. And that episode gives you an insight into how David behaved, because he was meant to do the interview at 11:30 on a Thursday morning. They recorded in the morning, but he turned up half an hour early, much to Mary's shock, because the studio wasn't ready. So Mary is thinking, what am I going to do with David Trimble for 30 minutes? So she rushes into the studio and says, "Guys, get this studio quickly, as ready as you can. David Trimble's half an hour early." So she goes out to see David Trimble, and he's with his security staff. And she says to Mr. Trimble, she says, "Mr. Trimble, we'll be as quick as we can. We're just setting up the studio, but we really will be as quick as we can. Can I get you a cup of coffee?" And he says, "I will not be mollified by BBC coffee." Then he takes a phone call and walks off.
As long as it didn't film him on the phone.
No, it didn't film him.
Main thing.
And the security police officer was with him, turned to Mary and gestured towards David and said, "Somebody needs to tell that man to F off."
Which man?
David Trimble, the security guy. He said, "I've spent the morning with him." And Mary said, "Best of luck." With that. So they do the interview. He then blows up during the interview and the whole business about decommissioning and the IRA. And then afterwards, in makeup, David Trimble turns to Mary and says, at one stage, he says, "I was very close at that stage to punching Noel Thompson on the nose." And Mary thought, "Do you know what? I wish you had done that." Because that would have made great television. And Noel thought Mary was being most ungenerous. So he did have a very, very, very short fuse.
And he didn't like BBC Northern Ireland, particularly.
He didn't like
Which is
BBC,
fair enough.
He didn't like BBC Northern Ireland. Just be careful, it's your employer. Well, for this evening, anyway.
Not for much longer, I'm sure.
And he felt that perhaps BBC Northern Ireland should have been less critical and should have been more supportive. He seemed to be quite happy in the company of Radio 4. So you'd often have this scenario where Good Morning Ulster would pitch for him to say, would you come on, you know, Gamoo, as it's affectionately known, at 8:10, and he'd say, no, not doing it. And then the next morning you'd tune in and he was on,
He came in
on the
once.
Today programme at 8:10. So he had, and certainly I observed him on a plane getting off at Heathrow, and it was Barry White that said, you watch him when he gets off at Heathrow. It said, it's almost as if the cares of Northern Ireland disappear. It was almost as if in London he was a different person.
And that's true, because the first time I was in Washington, Sinn Féin had got a meeting in the White House, and the Ulster Unionists, maybe not unreasonably, said, if they're getting a meeting in the White House, we're a bigger party, we should be getting a meeting in the White House too. So about 24 hours notice, we ended up in Washington with Trimble, and he was light, accessible, good crack. That's overstretching it. And I remember going for a drink in the Georgetown Inn with him, Jeffrey, and John Taylor, Lord Kilclooney. And that, I remember we had around 2 Budweisers each. That was quite a threesome. And he used to love Barnes and Noble bookshop in Georgetown.
Yes.
He would, because nobody knew him there, and he could be
Exactly.
he could be a free man.
But it's interesting you should use the word crack. One of the things that I discovered in this book was that David Trimble did have a good sense of humour. He had a quirky sense of humour, but he certainly had a good sense of humour. And my favourite story in the book, and Mark Neal is here tonight, and so I'm ripping, and Mark knows this because we've discussed it, I've ripped Mark Neal's story off 100 times, so I'm going to rip it off again, Mark. I'm sorry. But Mark Neal's story is they were about to meet Gerry Adams, and in the office, and this sort of seismic meeting, all the press were downstairs, you know, desperate for the slightest bit of information, any little tidbit, and just at that moment, lo and behold, the window cleaners arrive. So there's these 2 window cleaners outside cleaning the windows. So these 2 lads, I don't know where they're from, 2 lads from East Belfast, basically getting a free view of history. Thinking, oh, look, there's your man Adams. Oh, look, there's David Trimble of this historic meeting. So they realise, Mark Neal and David Trimble realise that they cannot conduct proceedings in full view of these window cleaners. So they decamp to Mark Neal's office, which is a smaller office. So it's explained to Gerry Adams, who David Trimble did not like. And they come into the office. Adams is standing awkwardly. David Trimble standing awkwardly. Gerry Adams eyes up Mark Neal's bookcase. Mark Neal has a bookcase with Northern Ireland books in it. David Trimble explains these are Mark Neal's books. There's silence. Adams goes up and down the books, looking at the books, and then turns to David Trimble and says, I see he has none of my books. Which Trimble replies, that's right, he doesn't do fiction. Sorry, Mark. That's about the 29th time I think I've told that story.
I've heard it at least 100.
And it is. I mean, it's a great line from David Trimble. And Hugh Jordan, who's here tonight, has a good story. Tell very briefly your donkey story, Hugh.
Oh, you do it. You get the microphone.
Okay. So Hugh and Henry MacDonald were flying to Labour Party conference. The flight is delayed. They spy David Trimble. They go to they're diverted to the Isle of Man. Then they're flown over to England. I think they get to either Liverpool or Manchester. They get in a hire car. I think it's Richard Gordon, the PR guy, offers David Trimble a lift. And to David Trimble's
An on-loan man, by the way.
yes, and to David Trimble's credit, he says, "But I'm with Henry MacDonald and Hugh Jordan, members of the press." He said, "Oh, they come too." So Richard's driving. David Trimble's in the passenger seat. Hugh and Henry are behind. And at this stage, I think it's fair to say you've exhausted conversation. You've talked about everything under the sun, talked out, and because they've been in each other's company for hours. They get to Lytham St Anne's, and they're on their way to Blackpool. The car comes to a shuddering halt. They stop, wonder why are they stopping, and there in front of them are if this is the correct terminology, a gaggle of donkeys. A gaggle of donkeys are being led across the road down onto the beach. So they all watch these donkeys being led across the road down onto the beach, and they move on. Hugh, desperate to break the silence, suddenly thinks of a gag and says, Mr. Trimble, do you know what donkeys get for lunch? And he says, no, Mr. Jordan, I honestly don't know what donkeys get for lunch. And Hugh says, about 20 minutes.
It was a terrible joke.
Which is a bad joke, but the point is this, Trimble finds it incredibly funny. And I think when Trimble laughed, a bit like you, I mean, some of you who are of a certain age will remember Mike Yarwood, the impersonator in 1970. Mike Yarwood used to do an impression of Ted Heath, but the impression was the shoulders moving. Exactly the same with Trimble laugh. If you were doing an impression of Trimble laughing, is the shoulders go. And correct me if I'm wrong, Hugh, but every time you met Trimble, you had 5 minutes donkey talk.
Well, that's, I mean, it's a stupid schoolboy joke.
Yes.
But it gave me a chat with him if
Yeah,
I wanted it.
yeah.
I think I phoned him 3 times in my life, and he always took it.
You always talked about donkeys, and he had self deprecating humour. You talked earlier, Gareth, about the DUP making a march on the UUP, and there was this particular election where the DUP were expected to completely rout the UUP. All the polls were suggesting people were going to lose their seats. It was going to be a terrible day for the UUP. David Trimble's out canvassing with Danny Kennedy, and they go to the Canal Court Hotel in Newry. They're hungry. So they're queuing up at the carvery, the kind of carvery. The chef's got a big white hat on and he's doling out the food to various people. Obviously recognises David Trimble. They've all got their tray and their plates. And the chef says, another potato, Mr. Trimble? Yes, please. Some gravy, Mr. Trimble? Oh, yes, please. Some vegetables? Yes. Some lamb, beef? Yes, please. He said, what about stuffing? He says, no, I'm getting that next week. So he did genuinely have a sense of humour. And I think when he was in those quieter moments with, a family-sized version of red wine, he was relaxed.
For all the stories about David Trimble we've told, not all of which were complimentary, we have to say one thing. Without him, there would have been no Good Friday Agreement. There's no possibility that any other Unionist leader at that point would have come along and signed that agreement. And that has changed the life of everyone in this hall.
That's absolutely correct. There are people alive today because of what David Trimble did on that snowy afternoon in April 1998. There are people whose lives have been changed. He could easily have said no. John Taylor would have said no if he was leader. Willie Ross would have said no. Martin Smith would have said no. Ken McGuinness would have said yes, but whether or not Ken McGuinness would have held the party is a debate. It's probably a PhD for somebody at Queen's, but Trimble was the right man at the right time, the only person who could have done it. George Mitchell says this, there is no peace process without John Hume. There is no Good Friday Agreement without David Trimble. And he weighed it up and he ultimately decided that by saying yes to the Good Friday Agreement, you were making a better Northern Ireland, and it was the right thing to do. And I hope history will be kind to him.
It was at the expense of his own party. Stormont never really worked very well when Trimble was in charge. And that's not, I would say, Trimble's fault. It was the fault of a number of people, not the least of which was the Republican movement for not decommissioning earlier. But did he hang on too long?
He admits himself that he did. There were people who went and had a quiet word in his ear in 2001, 2002, 2003. David Kerr, who was a trusted lieutenant, said he should have gone in 2002. Trimble even admits in an interview that he probably should have stood down in 2003 and perhaps given the party a fresh start. Perhaps there was talk, and it seems odd to use this phrase now, but at the time there was talk of a dream ticket of Reg Empey and Geoffrey Donaldson, and people thought that they were the two individuals who perhaps could have stemmed the tide of the DUP at the time, but he stayed on. He had an inherent belief that he had to finish the job. And Colin Ross, who many of us in this hall will know, who was a very fine journalist and a very good press officer and a very decent man, and was always a pleasure to deal with, worked for Seamus Mallon and David Trimble. And I interviewed Colin for the book, and he talks about a conversation that he had with David Trimble when, you know, all hell is breaking loose. You know, David Trimble, in David Trimble's world, he's getting bomb threats to his office. His children are being shouted at in the street. People are turning up outside his house to demonstrate. There's graffiti at the end of his road. He has to live behind bulletproof glass. He goes to meetings where he's shouted at. There's criticism in the press. You know, that's an awful lot to deal with on a daily basis. And Colin Ross said, why do you go through with all this? Why don't you just retire, go and live in England, enjoy your opera, enjoy your concerts, enjoy your travel? At that stage, he had bought a narrowboat, and he and Daphne were enjoying the narrowboat in the Midlands of England. And he said to Colin, and I paraphrase, he said, look, I have a job to finish. I have a job to do. People expect me to stay on as First Minister, to stay on as MP, and to finish the job. So he had an inbuilt belief in public service.
He went to the House of Lords. He became a Tory.
Yes.
People said they're going to give him a junior ministry.
Yes.
That never happened.
That's all correct. He always was a Tory. I think he was a conservative unionist. I think he was conservative in his social beliefs. I think, you know, even as a young man, his newspaper of choice would have been the Daily Telegraph. So I don't think it was a great transition from the Ulster Unionist Party to the Conservatives. I think he always saw himself as a Conservative. I think he felt that his race was run with the Ulster Unionist Party, although he felt at Westminster he still had a contribution to make. He believed privately, as indeed some of his friends believed, that if he joined the Conservatives, as he did under David Cameron, that he would be rewarded a junior ministry. I actually think he had the talent and the ability to be a minister. Where the plan went astray was in 2010, because the Conservatives did not win an outright majority and they had to rely on the Liberal Democrats to form a coalition. That meant there were less jobs to be given out. So in other words, the kind of job that David Trimble might have been given by a majority Conservative administration had to be given to a Liberal Democrat because they were in coalition. And I think he privately felt let down, because even when he joined the Conservatives, and you probably remember he was paraded on College Green, a place we know well, and the suggestion at the time was, he was photographed with David Cameron, the suggestion was, we are looking at a potential Conservative minister, and it didn't happen.
But does it really matter? Because he'll be remembered for his one greatest hit, and it was a big one.
No, you're right. In the grand scheme of things, David Trimble would be remembered for what he did in April 1998 and his time as First Minister, perhaps not of being a junior minister in a Conservative administration. But he regards that. He was asked during an interview what was his greatest achievement, and he said his greatest achievement was the Good Friday Agreement in April 1998.
The last time I saw him was at the fringe event at the Labour Party conference in Manchester. I had no idea he was ill, but you didn't have to look too hard to see that he was. and there was Doug Beattie was there, Jeffrey Donaldson was there, Jim Allister was there. It was that sort of an event. And I didn't go over to talk to him because I didn't have a especially good relationship. But suddenly I look around and it was where he was standing right beside me. And he says, "Cheer up, it may never happen." And the shoulders went like this. And I was actually, it was quite well, for me, it was quite a nice ending.
Yes.
If you know what I mean.
Yes.
Because he was unpredictable. You never quite knew what you were going to get.
No, unpredictable is a very good word. And when you would expect him to say something, he very often said the reverse. Or when it truly was a historic event, he would play it down. And that was a trait of his. So, for example, when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, he and Seamus Mallon were in America. They were on a trade mission. And the news, because of the time difference, the news would come to America in the middle of the night. And Trimble had made it clear that he wanted to sleep. He made it clear that he didn't want to be woken up, whatever the news was. And this was relayed to his officials. Seamus Mallon's office knew about it. Daphne said she was, but he made it clear that as far as he was concerned, the most important thing that was happening tonight was that he was getting 8.5 hours sleep, not the fact that he was about to become a Nobel laureate. Anyway, so the news reaches Seamus Mallon via the SDLP, and Mallon just couldn't really help himself and felt that he had to tell Trimble. So Mallon leaves his hotel room, which is very close to Trimble's bedroom, and Mallon walks in his pajamas. That's a great image, actually, along the hotel corridor, and says, "I've got to tell Trimble that he's just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize with Hume." So he knocks on the door, and for a while there is no response, and he knocks again, and eventually, Trimble says, "Who is it?" And he says, "Seamus." And he said, "Oh, well, it's late. It's terribly late." He says, "I know it is, but I've got some news for you that I think you might like." So he kind of half-heartedly opens the door a little bit and says, well, what is it? And he says, "Well, you and John Hume have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize." And he says, "All right, thanks very much. We'll deal with it in the morning," and closes the door. And, even when he went on the radio the next day, he was basically concerned that it was too soon. And, I mean, you probably had this experience where you perhaps doorstepped him at either in Downing Street, maybe in Downing Street, where he was meeting Republicans for the first time, or some particularly big event at Stormont, and the journalist would preface the question with saying, "Mr. Trimble, how do you feel on this historic day?" He'd say, "I feel fed up of you telling me how historic it is." And so he would often, and to use that good Ulster Scots word, he was thran. But like he surprised you at the conference, he did have that ability to surprise people.
He and Mallon didn't get on particularly well.
No, they clashed, as indeed Hume and Trimble clashed. But there were moments where they did work together.
We had points pass.
Points pass. And those images, so emotional in the midst of that horror and tragedy. And in fact, when Mark Durkan was watching the pictures of David Trimble and Seamus Mallon, shoulder to shoulder, going to the home of the grieving relatives, and the poignancy of that and the sadness of that, that gave Mark Durkan the idea to create an office of the First and Deputy First Minister. That's where that came from, watching those television pictures. And David Trimble did have an ability to show enormous acts of kindness where he knew that people needed help. And I'll give you two I'll give you three very quick examples. One,
You just give us two.
all right. Mary Madden was struggling. She went on to be a Northern Ireland office official. She was struggling at Queen's, and he helped her. He went into Long Kesh to help students who had been interned. They were students of his. He felt just because they've been interned, they should not be denied a legal education. He felt it was important. And the third one was he went to Rome to see the Pope. He was with an official, Moira Quinn, who was a Catholic. It had never been discussed that she would meet the Pope. They're just about to go and see the Pope, and he says to her, right, you're coming with me. And she says, no, 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 I am not part of the itinerary. This was never agreed. I did not ask to meet the Pope. And he says, no, you're coming with me. I want you to come with me. And then he said, and anyway, I think it would be nice for your mother. And that is a really nice act of kindness.
I remember Trimble and Malin being abroad somewhere, and they were doing a pre-recorded interview with Good Morning Ulster at 6 o'clock in the morning, and unfortunately I was there. And Seamus McKee was doing the interview, so they had the two of them in the studio, and it was a bit ratty, as sometimes it was. Yeah. And so Seamus McKee annoyed Trimble, and then he asked him another question, and there was a loud bang and silence. And he asked Mr. Trimble, and Malin said, I think he's gone. And the loud bang was the headphones getting thrown on the table.
Yes. Well, he did. I mean, the famous Channel 4 interview where he asked not to go on air, I think if memory serves me out, with a Republican, and they put a Republican on, and he had specifically asked to do that, and he accused Channel 4, I think, of going behind his back or not doing what had been agreed. And he threw at one stage he tried to throw the microphone off, and then he walked off set, but he was actually still attached. So he had to come back a second time to untangle himself. So yes, very often the Trimble temper was on display.
Right. To my great amazement, we filled an hour.
It's very good.
Which is what we were contracted to do.
Mm-hmm. Some of it's true, except the bits are made up.
Some of it's true. So I have no more enlightened questions, but I'm sure there are people out there who might. 10 or 15 minutes. Does anybody want to ask some questions?
Just bring the lights up a wee bit.
I can't see a thing.
If that's possible. You've all been very attentive. Did you enjoy that?
Yes.
Did anybody make
We didn't rabbit on too long, no?
Did anybody make for the back door?
Letitia.
How bitter a pill was it for him to be brought down or excoriated by Dr. Paisley and the DUP, and then watch Ian Paisley go into government with Martin McGuinness?
Well, I think he always felt Paisley wanted to be top dog, and he always felt that when the opportunity arose, Ian Paisley would go for that. We talked earlier about the poor relationship that he had with Malin and Hume and Adam. He had a poor relationship with Paisley. There was no love lost there, even though, as Gareth referred to, the famous picture of Drumcree where he's actually holding Paisley's wrist.
Rubicon.
Yes, he's not holding his hand, and his argument for that at Drumcree was he was effectively holding him back because he didn't want Paisley to be there first. He wanted, rather like two marathon runners crossing the tape together, he did not want Paisley to cross the tape ahead of him. But there was no love lost there. And he kind of had, and again it comes back, I suppose, to the Trimble sense of humour, he would have had a bit of a chuckle to think that this system that he helped design, that he was criticised for putting on the table, that he was told was a failure for unionism, that was a failure for democracy. Suddenly he was watching his arch enemies, the DUP, using the system and becoming First Minister. And I think there would have been a bit of pride there to say, well, actually, it has lasted. For all its faults, and Stormont has many faults, and the scaffolding around Stormont needs a lot of work, and it maybe needs revision because we are not in 1998 and things have changed. But I think he would look at that and think, well, hang on a minute, that's the system that I designed. I think probably they're a little quiet Trimble chuckle.
But the DUP then felt they had to give themselves cover by renegotiating, quote unquote, St Andrews Agreement, which you could argue is a much worse deal for unionism than the Good Friday Agreement.
Which Trimble would argue, yes, of course.
Okay. Anybody else? Dermot. Have you any observations as somebody who was there?
Well, much of what you've said
is untrue.
This is Dermot Nesbitt. You all know Dermot.
One observation I make whenever you say about the Good Friday Agreement was the best agreement, the only thing David I might have disagreed with privately. So I say this privately in a sense. Yes, the Good Friday Agreement was better than the Anglo-Irish Agreement. But I said what was offered in 1973 by the Westminster government, and I was Brian Faulkner's election agent there. There was a Council of Ireland where the ministers from both traditions had to reach a unanimous decision, otherwise it didn't happen. And when you looked at what the responsibilities were in that Council of Ireland, they were similar to what was agreed and implemented also by the DUP 30 years later. And I do feel Brian Faulkner, Jerry Fitt, that was like a voluntary coalition
Yes.
between Unionists and Nationalists. In fact, from a geographical point of view, Jerry Fitt became Lord Fitt of Bell's Hill. And Bell's Hill is about 3 miles from here, between here and Crossbar, St. Pete, Belfast. And where that came from was, during the war, Jerry Fitt was evacuated out to Bell's Hill. And therefore he had an affinity with that.
That's
And
interesting.
he called it Lord Fitt of Bell's Hill. But there he participated in the House of Lords, Jerry Fitt.
Yeah.
And there was a voluntary coalition of unionism and nationalism. And Sinn Féin wasn't even on the radar
Yeah.
at that time.
But the IRA were still active and would have been.
It was, but at the same time, I say on the other half, what the famous Mallon said, oh, Sunnydale for slow learners. I would say, well, the Irish government were slow learners as well, because they didn't change Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution until 1998. And Liam Cosgrave, the Taoiseach, in December 73, made it very clear that we still have the claim over Ireland as one island, and therefore we lost the Council of Ireland vote on the 4th of January, 74. Strikes came, the executive fell, Brian Faulkner resigned as party leader, and it wasn't for another 25 years to get an agreement. And it is similar in context to what was offered by the Westminster government in 73. That would be my comment.
Yeah, I mean, a really, really important observation. And it's a really important observation, and it's brilliant that you are here tonight, that you can link, 1974 with 1998. Do you think, knowing David as you did, when he signed the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, do you think he had the shadow of Faulkner on his shoulder? Did he ever think, am I going down the same road that Faulkner is going down?
I don't know, because we would have talked about it sometimes and they were private conversations. But the only thing I would add from a personal point of view, and we say it was very good personally, sometimes we would have gone to 10 Downing Street to see Tony Blair. And the cameras were at the one end at the door, and you were walking up 10 Downing Street, and he wouldn't have looked at me, but he would have talked through the side of his lip, because I have a bad back, I have to walk slowly, and he would have said, are we walking slow enough for you, Dermot? And he was being genuine.
Right.
He didn't want to walk too fast because of me. So he was thinking
Yes.
of my physical capacity as he was going to meet the Prime Minister. And I'm always conscious of that personal dimension of his,
Very good.
which he had, as you rightly have articulated
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
various parts of your conversation.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. Thank you, Dermot. Any more? This side of the room's getting them on. You're all very quiet over this side of the room, which I can't believe.
There's a man here.
Is there anything in the book about his fame?
Ah, good point. Yes, there is. He had a very traditional Presbyterian upbringing in Bangor. Parents were Presbyterian. They would have gone to church on Sunday maybe a couple of times. He got involved in the church and helped with the sound on a Sunday. When he got married, he felt it was important that the children went to church and that they went to Sunday school. Even when they went on family holidays, they would plan family holidays. He always tried to make sure that there was a church as close to the Presbyterian church as they could find. Yes, faith was very important to him. but not a, and there's no such word as preachy, but not a preachy faith. It was a quiet personal faith. And there is an interesting story which it was reported in the book for the first time when after David died, obviously the family were planning the funeral, and it became clear that it would be very much a public event and that public figures would be there. And they were told by Downing Street that Boris Johnson wanted to come, and there would be other cabinet ministers there as well. And the family were contacted, and they'd made it clear that it would be in Harmony Hill Presbyterian Church in Lisburn, which was the family church, and that there would be a cup of tea afterwards, various sort of tray bakes and sandwiches, whatever, in the hall next door, very sort of traditional Ulster style. And anyway, and then the official from Downing Street said, well, you know, if you know, VIPs are coming over from London, it's really important that there's a special area for the VIPs, for Boris Johnson and the like. And the Trimble family said, no, there won't be a special area for VIPs. They said, we are Presbyterians. Everybody is equal. And if you come to the service as a mourner, you can go into the church just like every other mourner, and you can go into the church hall and have your sandwich and your cup of tea with the ladies who've made the tea. So we're all the same. So there'll be no special status for anybody from London, which I thought was quite lovely.
On at the back.
Just thinking in his lifetime and career, you know, we saw the rise of the DUP, the usurped the DUP. Now that the passage of time and sort of, or what, nearly 30 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, what do you think his legacy or standing is today in Judaism? Is there people who think actually he was right? It's a much better society. Is that starting to sink in here?
Some have changed. I still think within unionism, his legacy is divided. I still think there are unionists who feel he made a wrong call and that they felt that the IRA campaign was petering out and that he made an agreement too soon and he should have waited. And they felt that he gave too much away in terms of allowing the prisoners, and that he gave Republicans too much space in terms of the decommissioning. So there are still unionists who feel that he was in their terms, a weak unionist. I did hear a story the other day of David Kerr telling me that there was a particular unionist in Fermanagh who made David's life hell and constantly criticised him and would have turned up at various demonstrations and hollered at David Kerr and at David Trimble, and was absolutely convinced that Trimble had made the right decision. And this particular individual has been on his own particular road to Damascus, and he has subsequently apologised to David Kerr and said, on reflection, I got it wrong. So I think there are people like that within the unionist community who are having those kind of personal discussions. There are people in the book who are critics. Arlene Foster's in the book. Obviously, she was against the agreement. Peter Weir's in the book. He's against the agreement. Arlene Foster thinks David Trimble got it right constitutionally as a lawyer, but she feels he got it wrong in terms of decommissioning and in particular policing.
We should point out, I think I forgot to mention, Arlene Foster and Geoffrey Dawson probably led that wing of the Ulster Unionist Party, walked out of Good Friday, and then subsequently joined the DUP. But when David Trimble was having his portrait unveiled at Queen's University, he insisted that Arlene Foster was invited.
He did, and this is really important. So David Trimble's relationship with Queen's University wasn't a good one, because he felt they didn't recognise what he had achieved. And also there was a lot of bad blood because he had been for 3 major jobs at Queen's, and he felt Queen's made a decision that this is not the kind of individual that we want to have a senior position. And I think the hierarchy at Queen's made that decision that they didn't want Trimble in a senior position. So that was the backstory to his relationship with Queen's. Queen's, to their credit, reached out. They said there would be a number of things. There would be a portrait by Colin Davidson. So Colin Davidson was commissioned to do a portrait which now hangs in the Great Hall, and it's a very fine portrait. There would be a lecture by Paul Bew. And at the event for the unveiling of the portrait, David Trimble said to Queen's, and I want to see the guest list. And they said, okay, you can see the guest list. And he said, and I'll choose the guest list. And they said, yes, you can choose the guest list. So David Trimble chose the guest list, and he insisted that those that were involved with the Good Friday Agreement would be on the guest list for the unveiling of this portrait. And he also said, and there's another person that needs to be there, and that is Baroness Foster. Even though they took different paths, and even though they were on different sides of the debate when it came to the Good Friday Agreement, he insisted, obviously, because she had been First Minister, she had been a Queen's graduate, and she was very taken by David Trimble's decision to include her on the guest list. And she went to the event, and she found it incredibly moving. And in fact, you subsequently were at the unveiling of Arlene's portrait.
If you hang around long enough, you get all these gigs. Yeah, she had a portrait unveiled.
Yeah. And I think that was another act, albeit at the end of his life, but that was another act of Trimble's kindness. He didn't need to do that, but he recognised that Arlene Foster had made a contribution in her own way, and Arlene Foster should be there. And I think it was a remarkable...
They were also, of course, Brexiteers.
Yes, that's true.
So they
That's true.
agreed about that.
That's true. That's
Anybody
true.
else?
Yeah, we've got more over here.
Did the Orange Order make life difficult for David Trimble?
Yes.
Make life difficult for everybody. That was a joke, by the way.
Yes. Well, Gareth's point, and it's well made, in that they helped him become leader, because there was a sizable proportion in the Orange Order that felt that he was a strong leader, and unionism needed a strong leader. So he got a strong unionist vote. Not all Orangemen voted for him. I think Trimble was also helped by the fact that that night in the Ulster Hall, leadership night, John Taylor made an appalling speech. Daphne Trimble says it was the worst speech of John Taylor's life. He said it was dreadful. And Dermot, you were probably there that night. I don't know whether you concur with that.
Did he not get criticised by a Lords or somebody in
He
the
did
Orange
for going to Buncrana.
Yeah.
There was a suggestion, the number of children who were murdered at
Omagh
Omagh.
bombing.
Yeah. There was a service in Buncrana for the children who were killed at Omagh, and David Trimble went there with Lord Rogan, and it didn't ultimately lead to anything, but there was a suggestion that disciplinary moves should be made against
Because
David
Orange
Trimble,
men are not supposed to
because
take
Orange
part
men are
in
not supposed to go to.
the
And
mass.
again, as you say, Letitia, there was the incident, obviously, in the deaths of the three Quinn boys in Ballymoney as well. So, and just as a postscript to Buncrana, I talked about, and to be fair to Mary McAleese, I talked about her comments about Bloody Sunday. Well, the circle is closed when David Trimble becomes First Minister and Mary McAleese becomes President of Ireland, and they are in the church in Buncrana at the funeral of a number of the children killed in Omagh, and there is enormous sadness, as you can imagine, in that church. It's a dreadful, dreadful day. And Mary McAleese and David Trimble are in adjoining rows, and they embrace. Now, that's rare for David Trimble. He's not a hugger, but they embrace, and Mary McAleese talks about it in the book. She felt as if that was a moment, almost as if their relationship had come full circle, and that the David Trimble that was in that church that day was a very different David Trimble that had greeted those Catholic students in hours after Bloody Sunday.
Any more?
Just
First
a
one.
brief footnote on that, something not be aware of. Mary McAleese was in the law faculty at Queen's.
Yes,
The same as David Trimble.
that's right.
And they both knew each other from a working point of view.
Yes,
And I knew them as well, working in another department. Knew Mary as well.
yeah. And she went for the job at the Institute, and she got the job at the Institute, and he did. It struck me at times, it's almost like a Geoffrey Archer novel, that she goes on to become President of Ireland, and he goes on to be effectively Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and they had both gone for this particular job, and she had been a student of his. I mean, it is uncanny. 6 degrees of separation. It is uncanny. Here were the two most powerful people on the island of Ireland. You know.
On the staff as well.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, that's
Man up
correct.
here in the corner.
Just John McCann.
Oh, John
Oh,
McCall.
John. Yes, nice to see you, John.
Ulster Unionist and deputy leader in Dermot Nesbitt's successor.
And don't forget NI21.
I was coming to that, give me a chance. I was going to say that Lord David Trimble was probably one of the people that inspired me to get involved in politics. I'll let those in the Ulster Unionist Party decide whether that was a good thing. But, you know, I voted for the agreement in 1998, and I've never changed my mind in the almost 30 years since. Even though by the time I was leaving the Assembly, I felt almost I was like one of the few Unionists that would admit, you know, publicly that they'd voted for the agreement. But my first experience into politics was as a council candidate in 2005. Dermot was the candidate here in Southtown. David was obviously in Upper Ban, and my council ward ran between the two. So we were out canvassing at times with both Dermot and David. And David was a bit, you know, he wasn't the most natural person at small talk and about how's the weather and state of the roads and all that. But it was a great experience to be out with someone like that actually canvassing. Yes, he went on to lose the seat, and that night in Banbridge, the DUP were just unreal. Even when he was speaking and very gracious, there was a lambeg drum outside just going over his voice. You know, it was incredibly unpleasant evening to be at. But David was one of my inspirations to get into politics. I did disagree with him on Brexit. I was a Remain voter. I still think it turned out quite badly. But I think for a Unionist to take us from where we were and my generation growing up, had Dermot and Brian succeeded in the 70s, I wouldn't have needed to have grown up in what I did grow up in, I believe. But anyway, in 1998, I was proud to vote for the Good Friday Agreement and proud to join the Ulster Unionist Party and support Trimble, even though, you know, the party was very much in the slide. It was, at that time, I was still glad that he was there and he did what he did, and I'm glad that I'm glad you've written a book, Stephen, about him. He deserves a book. Maybe deserves a good book, but we'll
Oh, dear. Sorry you had to go so soon, John.
John,
Thank you for.
John, if you did that in the Assembly, Mr. Speaker would say, I don't hear a question.
Just a comment.
Right. John, thank you very much.
Anybody else before
Thank
we
you very
wrap
much for
this
those
up?
some kind words you said there, John. Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's it.
There was a gentleman here.
Oh, man, sorry.
It's just, what was David's view on the referendum for United Ireland, and in particular, the 7-year repeat if needed?
You take that one.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Well, I think like a lot of unions, probably at the time in terms of 1990, there was a feeling that this is just not going to happen. That it's there, it's written, but it's not going to happen. And that as far as he was concerned, that the union was safe, and that, you know, the debate that we're having at the moment, and that it certainly appears to be having at the moment, and the media coverage that there is about that particular, that didn't exist back in 1997, 1998. It's a very different climate. And whether you can put that down to what John referred to there as whether Brexit has accelerated that debate, you can argue that. But certainly, I would have thought that, and I'm slightly speculating here because I can't think of a direct quote of his, but I would think he would have been quite relaxed about that, in the belief that he did not think that there would be a united Ireland in his lifetime because he believed that the union was safe. That would be my bit of speculation, but as informed as I can be.
In terms of, you wrote books about of the big beasts, and probably at that time there was a lot of big beasts in Northern Ireland politics.
Yes.
Who would you be writing about in 5 years' time?
Oh gosh.
We actually talked about that earlier on.
Well, Mrs. Walker would say none of the above. I
So if you do look at the two books you have written, both of those men basically forsake their party
yes,
for public service.
yes.
I mean, what politicians do we have now that would even think about, or that caliber, whether you agree with them or not, but do we have anybody like that at the minute that you could write about for today?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think that's a really important point. They both did. I mean, the parallels between Hume and Trimble are uncanny. I mean, and the parallel between we touched on Daphne Trimble, or the parallels between Daphne Trimble and Pat Trimble are uncanny. And they were, they were both strong, independent women who I think helped their partners see the world in a slightly different way. And I think Daphne Trimble helped David Trimble change his views on certain things, and I think Pat Hume did the same. Obviously, both men, both David Trimble and John Hume, both got dementia. David Trimble's dementia wasn't something that was very much in the public domain, and this is the first book really to look at that. But you are absolutely right. The SDLP and the Ulster Unionists are mirror images of each other, and both leaders had to watch as their parties were on the slide. Back to your original question, I can't think of anybody right at the moment, but I mean, personally, I'm going to take a little bit of a break because the Trimble book, I felt I had to do it very quickly off the back of Hume, but I'm just going to have a pause at the moment. But if I do something, you'll hear about it soon enough.
Is that
More?
us? Is there one more?
Now before I go, I have to mention an event. Des Lee, Miami Show Band survivor. Is it 2 weeks tonight?
2 weeks away.
2 weeks tonight with Martin O'Brien, formerly of BBC and Irish News, and he helped to write Harold Good's book, which is doing really well. So if you enjoyed tonight, you'll probably enjoy that as well. I just want to say thank you very much for coming on an awful night. Thank you very much for buying the book. Thank you very much for buying tickets and for coming along. If you want to stay around, I'm very happy to have conversations and sign the book. And a big thanks to Gareth Gordon, who did very well. Thank you.